There's a program called 60 Minutes, which is hosted by this power couple of Russian state TV.
В эфире программа «60 минут» по горячим следам. Здравствуйте, дорогие друзья.
Olga Skabeyeva and her husband Yevgeny Popov, who is also now an MP for the ruling United Russia Party.
Francis Carr has an unusual job. He watches Russian TV for BBC Monitoring.
After the invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February last year, 60 Minutes became 2.5 hours long and has 2 episodes a day, 2 separate episodes.
These talk shows haven't just doubled, tripled, quadrupled in size. They've overspilled into other TV genres.
They really expanded in a massive way. Essentially, all entertainment programs were dropped from Russian TV schedules. These talk shows are pretty much the only thing on. Even Russia's main sports channel has its own political talk show.
One person who understands the might of television in Russia is Zhana Agalakova, who was a long-serving state TV presenter before she quit over the invasion of Ukraine.
Switch off TV, because it is brainwashing machine. Just don't listen. Find other sources of information. Look at internet.
Olga Robinson, who leads our disinformation team, might disagree. She has done an experiment as a Russian user.
What we found was quite mind-boggling. When you do searches about some of the main events in the war in Ukraine, the picture that you see is essentially that of parallel reality that you would normally see on Russian state TV.
On the Global Jigsaw today, we look into how the Russian media landscape has changed following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We observe the Kremlin's narratives as well as the methods, and explore how easy it is to find alternative points of view. Some Russians call their TV set the zombie box. Has it won the battle of narratives? I'm Krassi Twig, and this is the Global Jigsaw, an original podcast from BBC Monitoring, zooming in on political, security and social shifts around the world through the lens of its media. Our team listens to, watches and analyzes media narratives in 100 languages.
Radio Tehran.
Right, we must go now to Moscow.
Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
I mean, have you got any thoughts on that?
In this episode, you'll hear Olga Robinson, Francis Carr and Krista Shattery from BBC Monitoring. And a warning, we are talking about an ongoing war. You may find some of the descriptions upsetting.
The very word war was banned on the 24th of February 2022, unless you're a state TV talk show guest talking about Russia's war against the West. The word war or invasion, you're even lost words as a journalist working in the field. You can't use them because otherwise you might face fines or prosecution and potentially also prison terms.
Olga is describing dramatic changes in the media from the very first day of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine.
A lot of the independent reporting that still existed and was freely available or just available for people even for subscription, it was squeezed out.
This is how Natalia Sindeeva, the woman in charge of the last independent TV station Dozhd or TV Rain, announced a pause in their broadcasting.
It was the hardest decision in our lives. We've decided to temporarily halt the work of the TV channel. We need some time and some strength to breathe and understand how to carry on working.
The team bid farewell to their viewers from their Moscow studio with an old slogan of resistance and a defiant no to war. In the meantime, in London, Olga and her colleagues were trying to understand if there was any corner of the information space left untouched.
When it comes to getting alternative information about what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Russia as well, YouTube, absolutely massive, freely available, but quite successfully, used by pro-Kremlin voices. It could be one of the possible explanations as to why it's still around. If you're an ordinary Russian who's not really seeking out news, you might not necessarily just accidentally bump into investigative journalists talking about war crimes in Ukraine. The oxygen of independent reporting, it just disappeared. We're talking about really drastic measures that were taken. Thousands of websites were blocked. Media organizations and journalists have been labeled undesirable or foreign agents.
The label foreign agent has been heavily used by the Russian authorities in the last few years. Olga explains what it actually means when journalists and media outlets have to apply it to themselves.
Foreign agent is a label that you have to use whenever you post anything online. And what you have to do is to include a very lengthy disclaimer of the fact that you are a foreign agent. It's really tricky with places like Twitter or even Instagram because it takes a lot of space. And there's not much space for you to share your journalism if you have to share your disclaimer first.
Here's the disclaimer, quite a mouthful. We've voiced it up.
This material was created and or disseminated by a foreign mass media outlet performing the functions of a foreign agent or a Russian legal entity performing the functions of a foreign agent.
Besides adding it to every single social media post, there are other implications as well.
This label creates a lot of paperwork for you as an individual because you have to declare any support or any donations or any funding. As one of the journalists has been saying in an interview, whenever they go for a pint with their friends, they then have to think of how they're going to report that to the Russian authorities if they paid for somebody or somebody paid for them. It creates this incredible level of bureaucracy, which makes your life really, as some journalists have been saying, really depressing and really difficult to cope with.
The list of restrictions on journalism introduced straight after the invasion is long. Krista Shattury, who's the producer of this podcast and who used to work as a journalist in Russia, put together this fact file.
On the 24th of February 2022, Russia's media regulator Roskomnadzor ordered all outlets in Russia to use only state-sanctioned sources of information or face punishment. A few days later, a raft of new bills clamping down on public dissent were signed into law. One banned what was termed discrediting the Russian armed forces. Another outlawed what was described as spreading false information about the so-called special military operation. These new offences carried jail terms of up to 15 years. Most independent media outlets were censored, including online broadcaster TV Rain, Echo of Moscow radio station, and news websites Meduza, Mediazona, iStories and The Insider. Many Western news outlets, including the BBC, first paused their operations to safeguard their staff, then moved most of them out of Russia. Echo of Moscow radio was liquidated by its board, while Novaya Gazeta, the editor-in-chief of which received the Nobel Peace Prize, suspended operations and lost its license. A few weeks into the invasion, something called the Unified Register was introduced, listing all current and former employees or members of NGOs, public associations and media entities labelled as foreign agents and revoking licenses. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International too shut their offices as a result. According to internet rights group NetFreedoms, more than 600,000 web pages were blocked or removed by the authorities. Almost all independent news outlets have either been shut down or relocated abroad. Hundreds of journalists have left Russia. In 2023, the country is ranking 164th out of 180 countries on the World Press Freedom Index.
What are the narratives allowed to flourish in this landscape depleted of pluralism? TV is where most Russians get their news from. By now, Francis has watched hundreds of hours of political talk shows.
I'd watch an awful lot of TV now. I wouldn't watch this much TV even if I was watching things I would like to watch. Even before the invasion of Ukraine, they rarely talk about Russia. The only time they talk about Russia is when President Putin has given a big speech or held his annual phone-in or perhaps opened some major infrastructure project. 90% of the time, they're focused on demonizing Ukraine, painting Ukraine as this hostile state which only exists to aggravate its neighbor Russia, or attacking the West. They say that the West is aggressive and doesn't want Russia to exist as an independent state. On the other hand, the West is in terminal decline. So they talk about this depraved group of nations, the promotion of LGBT plus values in the West, and how this is turning its back on Christian values, and how Russia needs to protect its own values. They do talk about foreign news a lot, in fact focus on what the foreign media is saying. Most of these shows feature lengthy montages from Western TV, from the BBC, from Sky News, from CNN, from French TV, from German TV. And this is then mocked and subjected to scrutiny.
Why is there such a heightened interest in the West, do you think?
I think if Russian TV is talking about suffering in the West, then Russians perhaps won't be so questioning about their own situation. They will assume that people all around the world are experiencing the same problems, and therefore they don't scrutinize the activities of their own politicians. On the other hand, I think there's this deep, almost inferiority complex that many people in the Russian elite have, that they have always been considered in Europe but not of Europe, and there's almost an obsession about what the West is saying about Russia and the criticism that Russia is subjected to in the West.
President Putin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov once complained about the lack of love by the West. They don't love us, he says.
Нас никто не любит, и любить особо нас не собирается, и нам это не нужно. Но кто-то же все-таки любит.
The reporter intervened to say, there are countries that like us. You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. Let's hear some of the most memorable moments from Francis's TV marathon.
The one that really stood out was when Dmitry Kiselyov, this top anchor on Rossiya 1, the main channel in Russia, threatened to destroy what he described as the British Isles with either a Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile or a Poseidon underwater nuclear drone.
Посейдон. Взрыв этой термоядерной торпеды у берегов Британии поднимет гигантскую волну, цунами высотой до 50...
Which he said would create a nuclear tsunami that engulfed the whole of Britain and left a radioactive desert unfit for any life.
В радиоактивную пустыню, надолго непригодную хоть для чего.
Do they actually exist, the Poseidon drone and the Sarmat missile?
We don't know at what stage of their development they are. They were both announced as potential projects by Putin several years ago, which Putin said the West simply wouldn't be able to respond to. And the nuclear threat is something we see quite frequently on Russian TV, in fact. There was another occasion on the day of the Queen's funeral in London when Olga Skabeyeva, another of the top presenters on Russian state TV, said that Russia could perhaps achieve some of its goals by bombing London.
Надо было сегодня тогда. Там сегодня все лучшие люди на похоронах. Прости, Господи.
And wiping out various foreign dignitaries that had come to visit.
Nuclear annihilation has been a recurring topic since Vladimir Putin brought it up a few years back, pointing out that if anyone threatens Russia, that would lead to a global catastrophe. And just a reminder, Moscow has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Why would we need a world if Russia is not in it? He asks. This phrase has been heard again and again in the TV talk shows. This is one of the star presenters, Vladimir Solovyov, who added, our commander-in-chief never bluffs. Never.
Напомню фразу Верховного Главнокомандующего. А зачем такой мир, в котором нет России? Он никогда не блефует. Никогда.
Well, I remember when I first heard it, and it was quite something. What are they trying to achieve with this constant nuclear threats?
I think really this is about telling the domestic audience that their country is a great power which can't possibly be defeated by the West because it has this ace up its sleeve, this nuclear threat that really precludes any kind of genuine military defeat. And we see this rhetoric really becoming normalized in the Russian state media and by figures including Putin himself, this idea that death is something not to be feared. Vladimir Solovyov, who is arguably the face of Russian state TV, once said that life was overrated.
Вообще, мне кажется, что, вообще жизнь сильно переоценена.
And that it was much better to die on the battlefield than to live a worthless life. And in a meeting with soldiers' mothers not long after the start of the war,
В ДТП погибает примерно 30 тысяч человек. От алкоголя примерно столько же.
President Putin suggested that their sons had really only had a limited set of choices: to die from alcohol poisoning or in a road traffic accident, or to die as a hero on the front defending Russia.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. Talk of sacrificed lives and casual chats about nuclear threats could seem heavy-going, even in short bursts. But there is occasionally space for a lighter touch.
Olga Skobeyeva referred to a story from the Daily Mail in which restaurateurs were suggesting that squirrels be eaten in their establishments in the UK.
В некоторых ресторанах будут подавать белок. Ввиду того, что животных много в парках, почему бы их не есть, имея в виду нехватку питания, но от решения...
This was actually part of an environmental initiative aimed at culling grey squirrels in the hope of reintroducing red squirrels. And on Russian state TV, this was completely misrepresented as part of the cost of living crisis. And it was suggested that people in Britain were now so poor that they were having to resort to eating squirrels.
And all these shows, are they similar to each other or are they quite different? Do they have their own style and personalities?
They follow a similar format. The studios all look very similar. The guests are stood around in a circle behind little lecterns. It almost looks like a game show setup. All of these presenters have their own individual personalities. Some of them are real ideologues of the regime, others giving you an insight into the performance. One example comes to mind with Andrei Norkin. He's the presenter of a show called Место встречи, or Meeting Place, on NTV. And after the Russian retreat from Kherson, what he said to the audience was this.
То я вам ничего не скажу. Если я поддерживаю это решение, то получается, что...
I'm not going to tell you what I think about the retreat, because on the one hand, if I tell you that I approve of it, then I am publicly undermining Russia's territorial integrity, because we've recognized Kherson region as Russia. If I criticize it, I am publicly discrediting the Russian armed forces. And for both of these charges, I can go to prison. And I don't want to go to prison.
Я в тюрьму не хочу.
And this was a rare moment of really exposing the extent of censorship in Russia. But at the same time, he felt it was possible to do so without going against the narratives that he's feeding his audience on a daily basis.
The presenter giving away the game of the do's and don'ts of state censorship is by far not the biggest surprise in Russia's post-invasion media landscape. There's criticism coming from unexpected quarters.
There's a whole lot of pro-Kremlin war bloggers that are massively popular, and some of the following is quite incredible, like hundreds of thousands of followers.
These people are war correspondents or military analysts with links to the army or to some of the forces such as the Wagner private military company fighting in Ukraine. They are broadly very supportive of the war and want to see Ukraine defeated and incorporated into Russia. They are also very critical of certain aspects of the ways in which the war is being waged, and often very critical of the Russian military leadership. And this presents a very interesting problem for the Kremlin, because the Kremlin has spent so much time and effort silencing the liberal opposition in Russia over recent years and preventing any kind of dissent against the war on that side, that it's almost allowed people from the other side, the nationalist voices who want Russia to win but don't agree with the ways in which it's being pursued, it's allowed them to develop more and more of a presence.
Let's look at the platform that hosts these bloggers and their massive following in a bit more detail. Telegram.
The Russian authorities a few years ago did try to crack down on Telegram because it did become a really popular source of information and an opposition safe haven where lots of opposition activists and bloggers and journalists were getting traction.
Then the war in Ukraine changed the equation. Independent voices became even less prominent.
After television, I think Telegram in particular has become incredibly important as a source of information. The audience absolutely ballooned since the invasion. Russia has blocked access to a variety of Western media outlets, BBC included. But these same outlets are not completely inaccessible. Some of them operate quite well on Telegram, for example, which is still accessible, and on YouTube.
This is interesting. Telegram seems to be an accessible gateway for independent news, for anyone interested.
It just became this massive source of both independent reporting and user-generated content about, war crimes in Ukraine, but also at the same time, a massive source of propaganda and disinformation and pro-Kremlin kind of portrayal of the war. Some of the most well-known TV personalities, media managers, are also on Telegram and have massive following.
The political talk shows we discuss here are part of a daily routine for millions of people, 2/3 of the population, according to the official figures.
Since these talk shows emerged in the wake of the annexation of Crimea, these real personalities have emerged on Russian state TV. One of them is Vladimir Solovyov. He hosts a late-night talk show on Russia 1, the most popular state TV channel, but he also hosts an early morning radio program. I think he may have even supposedly broken some record in terms of time spent on air in a 24-hour period. Solovyov is evidently very eloquent, but also frequently shouts and swears in his broadcasts and sometimes descends into a kind of mock German accent to ridicule German leaders.
У меня личные отношения с Herr Scholz. Ja, но что у него случилось? Значит, Herr Scholz.
I've heard him speaking in an attempted British accent or Georgian accent before. And then you have other figures like Vyacheslav Nikonov. He's an MP who also presents one of the talk shows. His grandfather, interestingly, was Vyacheslav Molotov, best known as Stalin's foreign minister, and also, of course, for giving his name to Molotov cocktails. And Nikonov comes across as this erudite intellectual.
Европа интеллектуально деградирует, абсолютная деградация.
Someone who looks down on the West and often talks about its intellectual decline and degradation. You also have figures like Margarita Simonyan. She's the editor-in-chief of RT, frequent guest on the talk shows. And around the time of the 2008 invasion of Georgia by Russia, she described information as a weapon like any other, which tells you a lot about how she approaches her job and about how the state media works in Russia. Anton Krasovsky, he works for RT, and since the invasion of Ukraine, he said a couple of things that have been so outrageous that Margarita Simonyan, his boss, was forced to suspend him from work.
You might remember this piece of news.
BBC News. The Russian state broadcaster RT has suspended one of its presenters after he said Ukrainian children who saw Russians as occupiers during the Soviet era should have been drowned in rivers or burned alive in their homes.
There's also Olga Skobeva, who now hosts 60 Minutes, which is 2.5 hours long, of course, and she is particularly hostile towards the West and vocally critical of Ukraine, even more so than some of her counterparts on the other shows. There's also figures like Artyom Sheinin. He's a former paratrooper who presents Vremya Pokazhet, or Time Will Tell, a show on Channel 1.
Здравствуйте. В прямом эфире Первого канала. Программа «Время покажет». Я Артем Шейнин.
He presents these sophisticated arguments which, to the untrained ear, really do sound often quite convincing, and he's very good at exposing Western hypocrisy when it exists.
Do you think they're all different because each one of them needs to cater to a different segment of the population?
I don't think that any of Russia's channels particularly targets a particular segment of the audience, but these shows are, on the face of it, so similar that perhaps the presenters need to carve out their own identity in order to remain relevant. And there's definitely an element of the Kremlin being behind these shows. You often see on Russian state TV the presenters using the exact same talking points or the exact phrasing.
Do we have any clues about how Vladimir Putin consumes media? Whether he loves these talk shows that you're watching?
Well, his spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, explained how Putin consumes the news. And we know that Putin doesn't have a computer or a mobile phone that he uses for personal purposes. And Peskov said that Putin is given a daily digest of news which contains extracts from state TV, the newspapers in Russia, and the foreign news. More recently, a man from the agency responsible for Putin's personal security defected and gave an interview to an independent Russian outlet in which he said that whenever Putin travels to meetings with other leaders, he always demands that he has access to Russian state TV. So there is definitely a sense that he does get his news from these news sources which the Kremlin itself is tightly controlling and is effectively telling him what he wants to hear.
There may be nuance and difference in style. Nevertheless, all these talk shows seem to share a similar blueprint. But what happens when you look away from the TV screen? Olga went online in search of reports on Ukraine, on the site of choice for most Russians.
Yandex is Russia's most popular search engine. The jewel in the crown of the Russian tech scene, largely been seen as very progressive, Russian answer to the Silicon Valley, has this very, very glamorous kind of vibe about it, because it does anything from search engines to delivery services to education and real estate and so on. So an absolutely massive company kind of dominating the tech sphere. Yandex maintains they are independent.
So how does the Yandex user experience compare to other search engines' front pages?
What we know from independent media reporting is that Yandex News, which is a feature that has existed for years on the front page, so instead of just a search, you see 5 headlines from media about stories of the day. A digest of 5 top news stories that people see whenever they open the front page.
So this is the search page that offers a curated selection of headlines, which you see before you search for anything.
It has been dominated by pro-Kremlin sources, either Russian state sources or overtly pro-Kremlin media. It really came to the fore at the beginning of the war because people went on Yandex front page to look for news about Ukraine. And what they saw is that, well, there's no war. From those headlines, you just couldn't see that there was an invasion happening. I think it's very important to note here that Yandex sold its front page with those 5 top stories to VKontakte, which is the Russian equivalent of Facebook and is owned by a Kremlin-linked businessman. Yandex still owns search function on that front page. But the rest, they say, is not their responsibility anymore.
And what about the search itself? How does that work?
Now, when it comes to how the Yandex search algorithm works and what happens when Russians turn away from their television sets and turn to Yandex to look for news about Ukraine, here is where it becomes really interesting. Obviously, search engines have very complex algorithms. There are so many factors that influence them.
Olga and her team have done extensive research on Yandex, involving an experiment with search terms, one of which was Bucha, the place of mass murder of Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. They used a virtual private network, or VPN, to replicate the experience of a user based in Russia.
What we saw was absolutely astonishing. The top 10 results featured multiple really obscure blogs that I haven't come across before, and I'm a Russia expert. And we saw 3 blogs that were all painting the picture that we either don't know what actually happened in Bucha, we don't know who killed the civilians, or they were not killed and Bucha was fake, or that it was the Ukrainians who did it, but definitely not the Russians. And some of the blogs had this very kind of forensic OSINT, open source intelligence kind of look.
It sounds like these search results would be markedly different from any other major search engines. Olga was trying to find a credible explanation for why that might be.
We spoke to both former engineers from Yandex and independent experts who understand how search algorithms work. They thought it was very unlikely that Yandex was manipulating results at such a huge scale.
So what was the alternative then?
All of the experts thought the picture is likely to be much more complex than just censorship versus non-censorship. So they thought there are multiple factors at play. Obviously, the crackdown on the independent media. We're talking about thousands of websites being blocked, so they disappear from Yandex's search results. Also, obviously, some media shut down because they couldn't operate any longer. They would also disappear from the Russian searches. The drastically changed media environment would impact the search results. Another possibility is that the Kremlin invests a lot into its media operations. Obviously, that includes work with how your content appears in the search ranking and knowing what kind of search terms to use and how to promote your content.
But would that be enough to produce such a completely different outcome in comparison to other search engines? Olga investigated further.
Some of the independent experts we spoke to, they suggested that there might be some signs of manipulation where fairly obscure sources would be pushed up the ranking because they are, for example, used as a source in Wikipedia, which a search engine would see as a reliable source. Let's say for celebrity news on Wikipedia, that would potentially help it move up in the ranking. The most interesting, though, explanation is that the Yandex algorithm is quite different from Google algorithms, but Yandex apparently does take into account some of the user behavior. It's possible that the more Russians look for articles like "Is Bucha fake?" and the more time they spend on articles like that, the more influential those websites and those sources would be in the search results. So it's essentially almost like a loop, or a vicious circle, if you like.
The team put the result of their experiment to Yandex at the end of last year. We voiced up their response.
As the leading search provider in Russia, we do our very best to provide our users access to the information they are looking to find. Yandex Search provides answers for search queries, displaying content that is available on the internet, excluding sites which are blocked by the regulator. Our ML-based algorithms eliminate human error and human interference. Our algorithms work by ranking the relevance of any document for any particular query. It is not possible for any person to interfere with the search results. As for news, we announced that we intended to divest our news aggregator. In September, we confirmed that we had exited the news aggregation business completely.
With thousands of websites blocked, looking for independent information is fraught with risks, and even a like on social media could result in a lengthy jail term. What is the purpose of the message getting beamed into Russian living rooms every day?
For years, Russian TV was aimed at driving people into kind of a sense of apathy. I heard countless times talking to Russians while I was living there was that they were vne politiki, which means outside of politics. They were proud to not have an interest in politics. That's something that happens over our heads and that we have absolutely no stake in. And so what's the point of us being interested in it? And the way that Russian TV achieved this was to throw all kinds of conspiracy theories at Russians and to really confuse them and undermine the sense that there was any kind of objective truth that even existed. And so that they wouldn't then question what they were hearing. From my conversations with Russians, there still is this sense of victimhood, this underlying sense that Russia has been ganged up on by the West is still present, even if Russians don't believe all of the narratives they're hearing on state TV.
The Kremlin's propaganda appears to use a combined approach, driving people into apathy, playing on their prejudices, as well as threatening them with punishment, all classic propaganda tactics. And at first glance, it seems to be working.
We're not seeing any kind of widespread opposition to Putin and the war inside Russia, but it's very hard to tell because there are so many other measures being taken to ensure that people, at the very least, keeping silent. On the one hand, the propaganda convincing people that Ukrainians are evil and that Russians are fighting for their existence, and on the other, these laws making it illegal to criticize the government, to criticize Putin and to criticize the war. It's quite difficult to really get to the bottom of whether Russians believe what they're hearing. I suspect that they believe enough of what they're hearing and that the propaganda has been successful.
There is a debate among Kremlin watchers about the role of the Russian public. Are they passive bystanders or are they feeding into these narratives? Here's a tuppence from Francis and Olga.
In a country which is as autocratic as Russia, it's very easy to see the Russian population simply as victims, but I think that ignores a couple of important factors. Firstly, many Russians harbour these prejudices, these beliefs about the West, which state propaganda feeds off this hostility that many ordinary Russians feel towards the West and exploits it and remoulds it in this way that allows it to become stronger and more potent among the Russian population.
I've lived in Russia all my life, pretty much, and I've heard that explanation of there's not much we can do. There's not much I can do as a person. I don't matter. My life doesn't matter. Whatever I do doesn't matter. They decide somewhere high up. And it started long before the war. And I think people who genuinely think different from the majority in Russia, there are not that many of them. I think in Russia for years there's been this sense of sort of almost like helplessness. And that's something that creeps up in like kitchen conversations among friends. You like either, you know, politics in Russia generally is like almost like a dead person. You either speak well about it or you don't talk about it at all.
Thank you to Olga Robinson and Francis Scarr. The producers of The Global Jigsaw are Krista Shattury and Lucy Bailey. Original music is by Pete Cunningham. Our studio engineer is Nigel Dix, and I'm Krassi Twig. Watch out for another episode coming up that looks back at the last couple of decades to understand how Russia got here. Stay with us a little longer if you can. Nearly a year and a half is gone since Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which uprooted and upended millions of lives. Our Russia team at BBC Monitoring too experienced it on a personal level, and they agreed to share their thoughts.
On one level, it makes me very pessimistic about the future of humanity. If there's a country of Russia's size which is capable of pumping out propaganda of this level of hostility and this amount of vitriol, it also makes me ask very difficult questions about my time in Russia, because I love the country. I dedicated years of my life to learning the language, going to university, and then moving there to work. And I have many Russian friends who, on a personal level, were extremely kind and hospitable towards me, and yet are capable of voicing the really quite poisonous narratives that they hear on state TV and talking about them as if they're fact without any level of scrutiny.
I'm half Ukrainian, half Russian myself, so personally it is incredibly traumatic. And particularly when, you have relatives that are being bombed in one country, and then you talk to other relatives and they can hear bombers heading to that country, just passing through. And it's incredibly difficult to comprehend this situation. You just live in this bad dream that just would never end.